Hi, for my primary source exercise 5, I decided to do Mary Tate protest Chinese segregation. And it's mainly about Chinese immigrants confronting anti-Chinese prejudice. Some key concepts. Jim Crow laws, a system of racial segregation mostly associated with African Americans in the South. It's still very important for what we're talking about here, the Chinese in the West. And then segregation, denial of access to white public schools, creation of separate schools. This kind of goes in more depth. Um, but we'll be talking about Mary and her experience with her daughter, trying to get into white public schools. The Knights of Labor, labor organization that fueled anti-Chinese hostility. Uh, the Knights of Labor are pretty important to speak about because they're one of the only groups that were excluding the Chinese mainly. From being a part of their group, and they were very against the Chinese. Who was Mary Tate? She was a Chinese immigrant who settled in San Francisco. Middle class, decently well off. And then the main important thing is her daughter Mamie Tate was denied admission to a white school, and this is what caused her to make this primary source. And then first-hand witness to racial discrimination in education, especially when it comes to Chinese. This is another reason why she ended up making this source. And eventually her case, which had went to the Supreme Court. Historical context. Tate v. Hurley, the case that I just mentioned, is about Chinese school segregation, specifically her own daughter, who was segregated from a white school. Then after Reconstruction, prejudice was common and extended past African Americans. That's the main reason why I wanted to choose this for my primary source. We've been speaking a lot about African Americans, black versus white, during the 19th century, which we should be because that's the main importance. Um, but I think it's really important for us to also talk about what other races were experiencing. For example, at the end of the 19th century, what the Chinese were experiencing. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a law that banned Chinese immigration. And then a quote that I added was, if she is good enough to play with them, then she is not good enough to be in the same room and study with them. And essentially, she's talking about her own daughter. And she's talking about how they all do the same things, they play the same ways, but yet you're forcing her to not learn with them. Argument. Mary argues that segregation is unjust, unchristian, and un-American. This is pretty important. During the 19th century and the end of the 19th century, Christianity was still extremely important. So if she wanted to get her point across, it would be very vital to say it's anti-Christian in a sense. And then she exposes the school board for prejudice, right? So she's a first-hand experiencer of what it looks like in the 19th century, late 19th century, to experience prejudice as a Chinese lady. That she tries to use logic, morality, and personal evidence to persuade. And that's mainly in the primary source where she's trying to persuade. She mainly focuses on the fact that she's experiencing it currently, using her own personal evidence, as well as logic, and then, of course, she's using faith to say that it's unjust. Significance shows the racial prejudice that extended to Asians during the late 19th century. Like I said before, but I find it pretty important for us to talk about not only black and white, like we have been primarily speaking about. That's why I wanted to cover something that didn't go over just that in my last primary source. Helps us show that, or helps shows us that segregation was not only white-black issue, like I just mentioned. Connects directly to later struggles in American history. And primarily I want to point out, I know we're not covering this in this current class because we're doing 19th century, but this shows what happens in the 20th century pretty well. And there's a lot of like important cases, especially around the 1950s, where this case will end up being referenced. And it's important to understand this case as a basis for what will happen later. And then quote, Chinese may live and dress so long as you know they are Chinese. Then they are not hated as one. There is not any right or justice for them. Last slide, reflection. This source helps us see the true scope of racial prejudice in America. It goes past black and white. It helps us see that not everything was black and white, that almost every single race has been prejudiced um, during this time and then later. And it adds depth to our 19th century studies beyond black and white. I sort of mentioned this before. Helps expand the understanding of American history. Like I said before, I think it's really important to go about cases like this one before you start getting into the later 20th century and future cases. You kind of get a basis of what was happening previously and what led up to those cases. And then I added, if I could ask any question to Mary, I'd ask, what does she think America will look like in the next century? And I find this pretty interesting because um, specifically in the 20th century, there were a lot of Chinese cases, and I wonder if she thinks America will still exist, if it'll get better, if it'll end up getting worse when it comes to prejudice for the Chinese. And yeah, that's about it.